Welcome to Catalyst for Healing. I'm Maria Lloyd, licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm here today with a good friend, Leslie McFadden. She is a survivor activist of sexual assault, and she's going to talk with us today about her healing journey and some of the experience that she had, and then also a technique that's really worked for her called TIR, trauma incident reduction. So, why don't you introduce yourself, Leslie, and let the audience know a little bit more about you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, my name is Leslie McFadden. I'm a rape survivor, and I have been on a healing journey since 2015. It has taken a very long time, but during that journey, I have also been volunteering with a nonprofit Rise. So, we currently work on passing legislation in support of survivors' rights. But in order to do that work, I also realized I needed to do my own healing. And eventually, I discovered this a fantastic therapeutic technique called trauma incident reduction. Kind of a mouthful, so I just say TIR, and I can get more into that. But that has helped me tremendously to not just handle my PTSD or make it a little bit better, but actually cure it, which is a very strong word, but that's what I love about it so much.
It's incredible. And that's why I love having people on here that are doing it's I don't know how new it is, but I've never heard of it before, but it's like using these techniques that really are unique because something different works for everyone. And you were able to figure that out through your own journey with different therapies and different techniques. But why don't we start? Your story is so powerful. And Leslie, by the way, we're going to put a link in the show notes, has done a podcast interview about the details of her story and has written a book that she's in the process of getting published. But her story is really powerful if you want to listen to the whole story. And we're just going to do kind of a short version today so that we can focus on the healing journey and the techniques that we're talking about right now. But why don't you go ahead and start just sharing a little bit about what you went through back in 2015?
Sure, absolutely. So I was drugged and raped by a coworker. I reported the assault immediately to the police and, trusted the process. I went through a tape recorded phone call to the perpetrator that I was told was necessary to move my case forward. And then when that call didn't result in a confession, I was made to sign a case closure form, which I didn't even realize that's what it was. My case was closed, even though I did the very thing that survivors are always told they have to do, which is report. My case was closed after that. And then it did get reopened in 2017, 2 years later. But by that point, most of the evidence was gone. And eventually my case was closed.
What was that experience like for you?
It was brutal, and because nothing worked, I reported it there too. It was it was compounding my trauma. I
Environment.
was in that environment for 4 years,
Wow.
and I later was telling a therapist who was doing EMDR about my experience, and he said that I was rekindling my brain with the trauma repeatedly
I'm sure.
because he was still there. I was still in that environment. And it was through those conversations that I realized I need to move away. I was living in New York at the time, and I realized I need to move away to just create a clean break. This is my old life, this is my new life. And that physical separation really started my journey. So that
Okay.
was 5 years ago.
Years ago. So what in terms of has anything been done legally with the situation or when you said the case was closed?
Criminally, that was it. I
Okay.
did as much as I could do, but it ultimately was not executed. I did go after him civilly. So that was something I did for myself to give him a consequence for what happened.
Right.
But criminally, that was it. I did participate in a DOJ investigation. They were interviewing survivors, trying to see if there was a pattern of gender bias with the sexual assault and rape investigations. Ultimately, they did open an investigation. That was 3 years ago.
Okay. I mean, that must be so exhausting to go through. It's a legal court process while you're processing all the trauma. I mean, what was that experience like for you? Because at some point, I mean, this must be common for survivors to just say, I don't want to deal with this. Like you stayed in it. And so, I mean, what What do you notice with yourself or other survivors in that process when you're dealing with so much legal stuff, you know?
Yeah. I will say that I had help in the form of my dad is he's a retired lawyer, but he was helping me understand the process a bit better. And I also had a wonderful friend and advocate named Jane Manning, who
Mm,
I met in 2017. She helped to get the case reopened in the first place. So she was absolutely fantastic at kind of helping me through that process and understand, next steps
yeah,
and helping me along. I will say it's very hard to do alone. So having some
having that
help,
support.
having an advocate, having a friend
Yeah,
or talking to a lawyer who can kind of help you through that process is huge.
yeah,
So that's one PSA that I have is don't do it alone.
yeah,
You definitely need allies, you need help. It definitely helps a lot getting through that process. But it was rough, I'm not gonna lie. I
yeah.
was doing therapy along the way,
Okay.
but it was hard to really treat the trauma when you're still in
In
it.
it.
You need that separation. For me, it was a physical separation
Right.
to kind of, just put a ceiling on the trauma. The other thing was for me, closure. Even bad closure is closure.
Right.
So for me, moving away, leaving that job, starting a new one, that
That
kind of put a
was
bow
huge, I'm sure.
that put a bow on that trauma so that I could start to really process it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's tough because you see these survivors coming forward, and it's like, one, it's a hard thing to talk about publicly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's gotta be a feeling of you're doing something to help other people do the same thing, which is empowering because you're standing up for yourself. So it's like the other alternative is just giving up and staying silent. And so, I mean, how did you navigate that part
Yeah.
yourself?
What I like to say is I'm suffering anyway, so I might as
Right.
well suffer out loud because then my being public about it and talking about it can maybe allow someone else to speak up
Yeah.
or fight for their rights or try to hold that person accountable. And I know not everybody's able to, of course,
Yeah.
but I'm hoping that by sharing my story and kind of all the ins and outs of everything I learned along this journey, I hope that it helps someone, at least, even if it's just understanding the process better. Like I've had a lot of people, really not understand the difference between a criminal trial and process versus a civil one. So even just helping people understand those nuances is really powerful. So I'm hoping that by sharing my story that
That's
others,
amazing. I mean, using it to help others is gonna help heal you, like, there's some
yes.
purpose in that. Tell us more about the organization you work for, because what does that offer people?
Sure. So after the DOJ investigation was announced, I was really looking for something new to do, basically,
Yeah,
because it was a very exciting to hear about the investigation. But then I thought, okay, well, now what? Now what do I do with myself? That was the thing that I was pushing for, and then it happened. Great. But then what do you do? So I came across an organization called Rise, which is led by Amanda Wynn. If that name sounds familiar, she's one of the astronauts that just went to space recently that was in the
right.
news. And she had passed the Sexual Assault Survivors Rights Act. I hope I got that name right. In 2016, which established baseline rights for survivors federally. And then what RISE has been doing since is trying to pass state versions of those federal rights in all of the states because most sexual assault cases are adjudicated in state courts. And so we're trying to pass those laws in every state. So I have been working on state campaigns trying to pass rights in each state.
Yeah,
And so that for me was a wonderful part of my healing journey because
mhm,
it's doing something proactive instead of just sort of, I don't know, sitting in the trauma, just
yeah,
kind of trying to heal. I wanted to do something that was a little more active. And so that has been a great outlet for me to just kind of throw myself into something new. And it was also very interesting just on the level of learning, well, how do laws get passed and I mean, really, I know kind of the, at high level, but I don't really know the inner workings of how does it actually happen. So that was a very interesting process. So I think that is that's a great way to get involved if people want to volunteer, learn how to pass rights in the States. That's just been a wonderful part of my culture.
Yeah, I love that. And I love thinking about how this process has helped you shift from being a victim to not only just a survivor, but an activist. And I think people underestimate the power of having a voice in the
Yeah.
world and how healing that could be. And so when we stay silent, a lot of times, I mean, I can imagine as a sexual assault survivor, it's not something you want to be public or talk about. But at the same time, the ability to do that and have an impact is part of the healing, right?
Yes.
Because you're actually authentically able to speak your truth. So, I mean, what do you think about that for you in terms of when you decided, how did that affect shift to be, the survivor to activist?
So for me, it started before volunteering for Rise. There was a shift. I think I started talking to reporters back in, I think 2018 was my first one.
Okay.
I first started by not using my real name because I was terrified.
Yeah.
And I was still in my job, so I was afraid of being public. And after that first interview, which by the way, something really wild happened when I was doing that interview. The person who interviewed me, it turned out, same detective. And I
Wow.
talk about that in more detail on the
Yeah.
other podcast you mentioned, but that was just, I mean, literally earth shattering for me.
That is, yeah.
Yes. And it just put a fire under me that I need to be speaking more. I need to put my
Mhm.
name out there. I need to show people that it's okay. It's okay to go out there
Yeah.
and talk. And now obviously you don't want to say anything that's gonna like put you in any sort of legal, trouble. You do have to be
Be careful.
yeah, you
Yeah.
have to be careful. But you can share your story. And so I started doing that starting in 2018 and I've been doing it ever since.
Mm.
And every time it gets easier to talk
Yeah.
about. Also, it's also useful for passing legislation. So that's a way that I use my story now is to use it as an example of why a certain right should exist because had it existed, maybe this aspect of my case could have been different or could have been easier or less traumatic for me. So now it's a wonderful tool that I can use to help pass legislation. So that's empowering for me because it doesn't the last thing I want is for my story to just be like a sob story. I mean, that doesn't help anybody. I really want to use it in ways that help pass legislation or
Yeah.
help people understand an issue better or
Empower
empower
themselves and know
themselves.
how to go through
Exactly.
the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it gets easier every time. I mean, I mean, no pun intended, but I've been an open book
Mhm.
and sharing my story. It's hard to know what the impact is because of course you don't really see the impact,
Yeah.
but I like to think that there's a ripple effect and that me sharing it helps somebody else
Yeah.
share it with somebody else and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, one of the things you and I talked about was obviously you've done a ton of therapy and there's different modalities. So, let's start with you started with CBT and EMDR, right? It's
The
accurate.
very first session I did, I think was just talk therapy. We were just talking and, you know, this was shortly after it happened. I was very, very shaken. And the therapist I saw said this is classic PTSD. And she recommended that I do EMDR, which when she described the process to me, I thought sounded super hokey.
It does sound hokey. I did an episode with an EMDR therapist. So, if you want to go find out what that is, but it's very effective for
Yes.
some people. Again,
Yes.
every modality is powerful, but
Yeah.
it works for some, it doesn't work for others. But what was
Yes.
your experience with the EMDR then
Yes.
at
So
that point?
I booked an EMDR therapist shortly after that. And because this was through my job at the time, I could only get 5 free sessions, that's what I could afford free.
Yeah.
So I went to her and we did the sessions. And the way she did it was she had you hold these electronic
Tappers. Yeah.
tappers that would pulse while you did your story. And then she would, say it back to you while you had this visual in your mind. And I will say that it helped me with the most, what I would call acute symptoms.
Okay.
So shortly after it happened, like I would sweat, like break out in a sweat every time I walked past a hotel. Red wine. I know it sounds silly. I was afraid to drink, but I was afraid to drink because I was drugged. So the thought of alcohol was intensely scary to me. So there were certain associations and fears that just went away after those sessions.
Wow.
And so it was very helpful for
Yeah.
those like most intense symptoms. Yes. So it was helpful for that. And then, like I said, because I was still in that job and sort of like harming my brain over and over and over by
Right.
still being there, there was a lot of trauma,
Yeah.
just kind of ongoing.
It became more complex.
Yes. Yes, it
Just
became more.
well, you were there for 4 years.
When I told a
Oh my
when I told a
gosh.
therapist, my first therapist in California, that I'd stayed at that job 4 years,
When you told me that, I was like, wow. I mean,
she
that must have been awful.
it was awful. I mean,
Why do you think you stayed so long?
well, there were 2 reasons. One, I mean, there were plenty of times where I would be on a job hunting spree and I was,
Yeah.
really aggressive about sending out applications and interviewing. I mean, I did interview a lot over those 4 years, but then I would go through spurts where I would be defiant, you know? I
Mhm.
just had this sense of, well, he should leave. I
Oh, I
shouldn't
could see
leave.
that. Yeah,
I
yeah,
should
yeah.
leave. Like, I'm good at this.
And
Like,
tell the audience what you do for work.
so I'm a content designer. I've been doing so it's like UX
Mhm.
writing is kind of the simple way to describe it. But I have been doing that for the past 11 years. And I was pretty new at the job when this first happened, but I did develop, some skill at doing this over the years. It was a good paying job and I just didn't think it was fair that I should have to leave.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe I'll just wait him out and he'll leave. It didn't happen.
Wow.
And so there was a mix of defiance and then just struggling to find a job.
Sure. Sure.
But it wasn't for lack of trying. 'Cause
Yeah.
I did
Yeah.
I did try. And the funny thing is once I pivoted to let me stop looking in New York, look in a different state, let me look in California.
Was that what brought you out here?
That's what brought me out here.
Really?
And so
Okay.
once I started, shifting my mindset, like, what if I left the state? Like, I'm
Yeah.
so fixated on New York. What if I left the state?
Yeah.
Once I did that, it was like magic. I started hearing from recruiters in California out of nowhere, and I ended up getting a job at Facebook,
Okay.
and
That's
that's what took me
amazing.
out to California.
Awesome. So you've done the EMDR, it's helped with those kind of main
Yes.
PTSD symptoms, but then you've got the complex PTSD from
Yes.
4 years in the job. And so at what point were you going to therapy this whole time or was it on and off depending on?
It was on and off. I did end up doing EMDR a second time when I realized my symptoms they'd shifted, but they were bad.
Okay.
Like I was very easily startled, like
Mm,
very easily. And
it's
I would
very
be like,
common.
yes. And I would feel like anxiety, like a physical sensation of anxiety all throughout my body. Like I'm talking like arms,
Wow.
legs, like everywhere. It was really bad. And I thought like this is unsustainable. I
Yeah.
need I need EMDR again. So I went back and this time I saw a person who was like he was like I call him Mr. EMDR because this is all he does.
It's really
He's,
good at it.
yeah, written a book about it. He really knew his stuff. And so that was very expensive. So I couldn't go all the time.
Yeah.
Um, but I had to pay out of pocket for that. But that was helpful to a point. It
Mhm.
did help me with some of those symptoms that I was having. But eventually I stopped going partly because I moved. But I,
Yeah.
I didn't pick it back up once I got to California because I saw that there was kind of a limited improvement. I did continue to to do some therapy while I was in California.
Mhm.
I saw one person who was doing ACT,
Yeah.
or I don't know if it's ACT or ACT. But I was doing that and that was helpful as well. That was my general problem with all the therapies that I tried is they were helpful to a point.
Okay.
And then I just kind of felt like I hit a plateau and that's about as good as it can get.
Okay. So tell us about
Yes.
TIR, which I had never heard about until we met and you were
Yes.
telling me about it, and trauma incident
Yes.
reduction. And so you're going to explain today, because I'm really excited to look more into this. How did you stumble upon this and then find a therapist? And then now you're training to actually utilize this technique because you have found it so powerful. So help us understand a little bit more about
Yeah.
TIR.
Absolutely. It had eventually stopped going to therapy because I wasn't getting better, and I just sort of accepted, okay, this is how I am now.
Yeah.
It's not getting any better.
Right.
This is, as much improvement as I can hope for. And I was listening to this podcast that I ended up going on.
Mhm.
It's called Sexual Assault Survivor Stories.
Yeah.
And I was listening to it for a while, and I came across an episode where one of the guests was talking about the secondary PTSD that he experienced from his daughter's rape. And it's an incredible story. Like that's definitely an episode to check out. And he was talking about a therapy that he did called TIR. And he said that he had previously tried talk therapy and it helped, but not really. So he started doing TIR. And then after a few sessions, he no longer felt the symptoms of PTSD. And this, in his case, his daughter, just a few sessions.
Wow.
And I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. I have been doing therapy for years and I cannot say that I'm past my PTSD.
Yeah.
So I wrote it down like TIR. Like I've never heard of this. And he mentioned the name of the therapist that he saw. So I wrote that down. And so I looked up this person and I read about it. It's been around since the 80s, by the way. It just doesn't have as good of
Techniques. It's
yeah.
incredible. It's all about the PR because
Yes.
I mean, I don't know. Some of these have been around forever, and then finally they get their
Yes.
spotlight. Like
Yeah.
IFS has been around for so long, and now finally people are like, "This is great."
Yeah.
So anyway, go on.
Yeah.
80s. That's so funny.
Yeah. So I was surprised that I assumed it was brand new, but it's actually been
Yeah.
around since the 80s.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, it's definitely cheaper than the EMDR that I've done before. So let me give this a try. And so the way that we started out was first we did an inventory of all of the traumas in my life, big or small. And it was interesting to me because I had been so fixated on processing this one trauma that I hadn't even considered that there are other traumas.
Yeah.
And that you may have just not thought of it that way before. But for example, deaths and illnesses
Sure.
and drug addictions, like all kinds of stuff that maybe you didn't even think of as like big C trauma is a trauma. So we started out by
Did you do a timeline from childhood to through, or how did you
it.
list that up?
Yeah, good question. So we just went through a series of questions,
Okay.
like were there illnesses? Yes. Okay. Like who was it and when did this happen? So you just make it a straight inventory. You're not telling a story, you're just making an inventory.
Yeah.
So then you go through and you rank each of those incidents in terms of interest of addressing it from 0 to 10. So just because, for example, let's say there was a death in your family when you were 5, maybe that's not something you really care about addressing.
Yeah.
So then you rank them. And so that was an interesting process too, because I realized that things that I had not really thought of as being super important in that moment, I realized, oh, wait, that is important. So I do
Yeah.
want to talk about that.
Right.
Or this has been, a traumatic relationship. I do want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And so that even just that process alone was helpful for
Right.
understanding like what are the chains of traumas that have happened in my life
Mhm.
that I would like to address. And so then you just literally start with the items that are most of interest. So again, it doesn't have to be that this is the like the biggest traumas aren't necessarily the ones that you want to address. And so then you just kind of go on down the list. And one of the main techniques
You start with the most severe.
yes,
Yeah.
according to you.
Okay.
Yes,
According to you.
the most severe. So
Okay.
it's client led. And then for traumatic incidents, you want to locate a video of the incident in your mind. And so you have or what he had me do was, visualize the incident, start at the beginning, move all the way through in my mind. And then I'm supposed to say when I get to the end, and then I say what happened. And then there's no judgment, there's no interpretation or anything like that. Then he asked me to go back through it again. And we do it again and again and again and again. And it can take a long time. But the idea is that eventually it starts feeling lighter. It
Okay.
starts feeling lighter, or you have a shift in the way that you're thinking about it,
Hmm.
or you look lighter. And if it's not getting lighter, that usually means there's a really similar incident.
That's fascinating. I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, because and there might be, you might be
Right.
going through it and then realize, wait a minute, this is actually like this other thing that happened.
Yeah.
And you just didn't realize they were connected.
Oh,
And so it's super interesting.
how many times would you be saying it over and over?
It went on for a while. I think the first time I did it, I mean, I didn't count, but I don't know. I think we went through it like, 8 or 10 times.
Okay.
And the other thing is that, because this might be a question your audience might have, like, well, what if it's like not just one moment in time, but like, a long stretch of
Yeah.
time, you know? So you could slice that up into like what was like the most traumatic moment.
Right.
So you could do it that way. You could also deal with the relationship. So if it's a
Mm,
relationship that you want to focus on, you
yeah.
could do it that way instead of like a single incident.
Okay.
So it's client led,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
depending on how they think about it,
Right.
you can process it that.
So would you notice like when you start talking about it the first time, you're really activated, and then as
Yes,
you keep talking,
you can feel it.
the activation starts to
Yeah,
shift?
you
That's
can
so
feel it.
interesting.
So even maybe not even the first time, but maybe as you say it second time or the third time, the emotion really comes up, and
Yeah.
any negative feelings that you've had, like guilt or shame or could have, would have, should have, all of that can
Yeah.
just come out. So it's not necessarily the first time you do it, but as you keep talking about it, different things come up.
Yeah.
And then for me, one of the interesting things that happened, and everybody's different, but one of the interesting things that happened was the incident would get fuzzier the more I talked about it. Like it wasn't like I was erasing my memory, but it would feel less sharp, if that makes
Interesting.
sense.
Okay.
It would be like harder to remember every single detail in the perfect order. So
Right.
that was an
Are
interesting
they
shift for
checking
me.
somatically what's happening? Like I'm imagining, you start out and your body's really tense and then it starts to relax, or what did you notice?
I noticed that it got less emotional the more that I talked about it.
Okay.
Now, sometimes, now that I'm learning the technique myself, sometimes it
Yeah.
won't be super obvious. Like, it's one thing if the person is smiling or they look like they've just had an epiphany, like, then you kind of know,
Yeah.
like, it worked.
Yeah.
But sometimes it might not be obvious. So you have to ask, like, is it getting lighter or heavier? And you want it to get lighter and lighter and lighter.
Yeah.
But if it's getting heavier, that usually means there's something else that
And is
is
the
really,
client picking that up, or is the therapist
it can be both.
okay
It can be
saying,
both.
hey, let's think about, is there other incidents that feel familiar to that
Yes.
feeling?
Yes.
And then you go into that
Yeah.
memory and do the same thing.
Yes.
Okay.
If
Interesting.
if it's getting lighter, then you stick with that incident. You don't go looking
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
others. But if it's not getting lighter, then you would try to find an earlier similar.
Okay. And is that pretty easy to access? Like when you're doing it, to find the earlier incident, or is there anything else that you're asking to
It's
help the person access that?
it's for me, it was pretty easy to access
Okay.
because I realized that there were other incidents that were like kind of highly related to this incident that I realized I need to talk about this other thing that happened.
Yeah.
And so for me, the association was very obvious.
Okay.
But you might need to prompt the person a bit, like, was there an earlier similar incident where you felt similarly or had, kind of a similar experience
Yeah.
to get them to identify that.
Okay. It's really interesting. So, how many sessions did you do, and how did you feel before and after?
Yeah. I didn't count, but most people, it takes about 10 sessions or less
Okay.
on average. Of course, everybody's different.
Sure.
And it depends on what you're processing, of course.
Yeah.
So that sounds about right for me. I would have to go back and check, but it was a very stark difference. In fact, I just took there's a questionnaire at the end of uh, the training session that you take to show kind of your before and after, and the numbers were extremely clear. How? So as of yesterday, when I took the questionnaire, I no longer had PTSD. That's amazing. Which was huge. And that was just like a really, I don't even know how to describe that feeling. It was huge because I've
Yeah.
had PTSD for so long, and suddenly I don't.
Yeah.
That was wild to me.
That's so
Yeah,
exciting.
it's very exciting.
Yeah. Because I mean, again, there's never a quick fix, but
Of course.
something like this, I mean, if it works in a this specific of a way for
Yeah.
PTSD, then it's worth trying. I'm of the
Yes.
mind of like, try everything.
Try everything.
Yeah.
That
And
was my attitude as well, especially because I'd tried so many different things
right.
and hadn't seen that much success. And, I was kind of skeptical when I first went into it because I thought, can it really work for an old trauma? And I remember Victor, who's my therapist, he said, well, yeah, it's designed for old traumas.
Right.
In fact, it's harder when the trauma is still happening, right? Because it hasn't shifted into the past, it's still unfolding. So I may need more sessions as I go through a personal issue right now.
Let's explain that for a minute because
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. So it's hard to even like grief, let's say, it's
Yes.
hard to fully grieve something until it's over. So this is where it gets so complex because if you're still in the situation, then how do you explain that for yourself? Like you're still in kind of a survival mode, right?
Yeah. I mean, for me, and I won't get into it, but I'm going through a divorce right now.
Yeah.
And it's super, super fresh. It's not something that happened 5 years ago where at least I've gone through the process and I'm at least on the other side of the legal process. I'm not even through that part yet.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's kind of an active trauma. So, but that doesn't mean I can't do sessions and kind of process things as they happen. So I think it's still a good idea to go and try this even if you're going through an active trauma. It just you may not be cured of PTSD until the trauma stops actively happening.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
for sure. Like once you're out of the legal process, then
Yeah.
you're going to have a little more freedom to
Yes.
process more.
Yeah. So I might need more sessions, once that is over and done
Yeah.
with. But I think it's helped me tremendously so far, just kind of deal with what is actively happening.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we're going to put every like link in the show notes of how you can, I can't remember what you sent to me, but how they can reach you, the
Yes.
organization you're part of. We can include the therapist you're working with and the technique if people are looking for, something like this to try.
Yes.
And I just want, to share with people like if you're struggling with sexual assault, it's very complex, it's very traumatic, and you need support. And I think that was the biggest point, whether it be support for the healing journey, for the legal process, just friendship support. Don't go through it alone because that just adds to the trauma. I mean, the aloneness can make your depression worse. It can make everything worse. So reach out for support. There's wonderful organizations beyond Rise to
Yes.
that that can provide support. So just thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story today.
Yeah. Glad to be here.
All right. We'll see you next week at Catalyst for Healing. Bye.